Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
The Second Vatican Council talked about taking an entirely new attitude towards warfare as a result of the introduction of these tremendously destructive weapons. We had to rethink and so on. And I think that's part of what the bishops are trying to do, and probably what all concerned citizens have to do, to try to see if our attitudes, outlooks, our moral perspectives are really in line with the reality of our world.
Joining Father Bacik in this discussion is Father Dan Ring, pastor of St. Ignatius Parish in Oregon. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of the Bishop's Peace Pastoral, the promotion of peace. Here's Father Bacik.
Dan, I know you share my interest in trying to promulgate and disseminate the information in the Bishop's pastoral letter on peace, which has been much in the news. It seems sort of an obligation and responsibility to get the news out about this document and to try to promote debate about it. I think we have to remember that the bishops, in making this strong and long statement on the peace question, are trying to influence the public debate, and so there's a sort of an educational process that goes on in relationship to it. And I myself, I know, feel it's sort of a responsibility to do that. I suppose I'd feel a need to talk like this even if I thought about 3 people were listening. Because apart from results in all of it seems to me that we need to sort of bend our minds and wills to working on this question. And a first step, really, is to get people thinking about all of it. And I think the Bishop's document has done a good job along that line. It's gotten a lot of publicity. I mean, there's probably not many people who haven't at least heard something about it. It's been on the news and in the papers, and the Reagan administration has seen fit to respond to it, and so on. So I guess, again, I'm presuming your interest in doing all of that.
For sure. I think what we live in today is pointed out in the pastoral as a peace of a sort, but it is debilitating to many people, to the threat of the use of nuclear arms, and there is the possibility of creating a much more just and peaceful climate with the efforts that we make as Americans.
The Second Vatican Council talked about taking an entirely new attitude towards warfare as a result of the introduction of these tremendously destructive weapons. We had to rethink and so on. And I think that's part of what the bishops are trying to do, and probably what all concerned citizens have to do, to try to see if our attitudes, outlooks, our moral perspectives are really in line with the reality of our world, that indeed we are in a position of being able to destroy civilization as we know it, and perhaps even, as some have suggested, through a nuclear holocaust, to make this earth uninhabitable.
Yeah, and our cues for that are not going to be simply from present-day policy, either ours or Russia's or any other country. It's going to come from a deep sense of the importance of persons, that the structures that persons live in are built over years and centuries. The culture that we formed are built by decisions that we make today. So those decisions are within our reach.
Dan, when the bishops wrote their pastoral, all through the various drafts, 4 different drafts, and then really the final edition of it all, they maintained that same structure of the documents. Really is divided up into 4 parts, isn't it? And that first part, how would we characterize that? As presenting general principles and so on, the whole idea of peace in the kingdom, working for justice in order to secure peace, giving us an outline of the pacifist position and the just war theory. How did they title that? Do you remember? It was the first part. I'm not recalling exactly how that was said.
They call it simply Peace in the Modern World, Religious Perspectives and Principles, and I think it looks to the gospel to find out what the cues are from the good news that Christ taught, but then it moves the language into a more rational discourse that is communicable to a wider segment than just believers.
Yeah, that's really important. I think that people listening say, well, what is the Catholic bishop's pastoral on peace and war got to do with me? And I think the bishops envision drawing the American citizenry as a whole into this debate, and a lot of times use language that ought to appeal to people who are not particularly religious or who are of varying religious backgrounds. And then in the second part of the document, we really get the moral principles and a lot of the conclusions, don't we? It's in that second part where we hear strong no to initiating nuclear warfare, to using nuclear weapons in a retaliatory way, and even a qualified, lot of qualifications about the possibility of even a limited nuclear war. So in that second section, we have that whole idea of the morality of it all. And then in the third section, they entitle that, I think, the promotion of peace, proposals, and policies. And that's where we would like to center our attention now, I think, on that whole business of what they have to say in their document about the promotion of peace in our world. And one of the things they talk a lot about is the whole work for arms control. They're not going to advocate unilateral disarmament, but they really are interested in so many ways of controlling the proliferation of nuclear weapons and gradually reducing the arsenals that both sides have. So they support the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, which in many ways hasn't been kept, among other things. So let's talk a little bit there, Dan, first of all, about this whole work for arms control and what they see about that.
It's in the context of having accepted in a very cautious and hesitant way the policy of deterrence. And the very first policy that they recommended in the face of deterrence is one that tries to cut the liability for war. And the statement is that they would support immediate, bilateral, and verifiable agreements to halt the testing, production, and deployment of new nuclear weapons systems. This was a controversial issue in the text because it seems to draw the bishops very close to the nuclear freeze movement. I don't think they intend to be a part of any particular organization or coalition that's operating in 1983, and yet they want to be present there. They want to be a part of a movement that's good and that has the same goals.
Yeah, they did put in a footnote, didn't they, in relationship to that language, that they did not intend to identify themselves with any particular political movement. But read the quote again, Dan, and it seems important.
It says support for immediate, bilateral, and verifiable agreements to halt the testing and production and deployment of new nuclear weapons systems is recommended. Mm-hmm. The verifiability is accepted as necessary,
mm-hmm.
and we've made progress technically the last 10 years. I noticed Senator Glenn, who once was not for the SALT II treaty, has come around to say he would like to see that reintroduced into the Senate because the tools of verification are now present.
And I believe he really studied that question very closely, didn't he?
He's a pro.
Yeah. That's a very interesting fact. So he now thinks that we can verify in a better fashion than we were able to before. At least he sees that we would be able to keep some control over that, huh?
Mm-hmm. And this particular statement has to do with new nuclear weapons, but the bishops
mm-hmm.
go on and talk about that there needs to be deep cuts in the present stock of weapons on both sides to make a safer world. They go on to talk about minimizing the risk even in regard to conventional forces. But there comes a conflict in that some people feel, for example, in Europe, that the relationship between nuclear and conventional defenses is a trade-off. We may have to get into a build-up of conventional
okay, that's perhaps another point. We'll save that for just a moment. But on this whole idea of trying to control this situation, I noticed they said other things too, like suggested that nuclear weapons be kept away from border areas, where perhaps the attempt that people would be overrun and would some commander in the field perhaps would decide too quickly to launch a nuclear weapon. They supporting, as they said, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And they make the interesting kind of suggestion that perhaps both sides could attempt some limited independent initiatives in which they would cut back on weaponry. The model they used for this is back in 1963 when President Kennedy announced unilaterally that the United States would forego testing. And at that time, Khrushchev's response was, I think within a month or so, to propose this limited test ban plan. And they say, now there's an example of where we at one point took an initiative to reduce or not do something, and the Soviets did respond positively, probably because they saw it was in their self-interest. Now that really is, very debatable kind of issue here, but the bishops, I think, make that strong suggestion, and it seems like that can easily, not easily, but can be done without calling for unilateral disarmament, without putting ourselves in any kind of disadvantage vis-a-vis the Soviets. Most people feel, well, I shouldn't say most people, but it's a fact that, we can destroy Russia many times over with all of the weaponry we have. It seems to me there's a common sense kind of argument that says we don't always need to have parity with them, or we clearly don't have to have superiority. I always go back to that column that James Kilpatrick wrote about common sense, the conservative commentator, who said that, what earthly difference does it make if the Russians have a few more megatons of nuclear weaponry than we do? And what difference does that make? And I think if you adopt that sort of what I would say common sense position, that we can destroy them so many times over, why do we need to do it more? That frees us, it seems to me, to do what the bishops are saying here, to take some independent initiatives in reducing our weaponry without really fear, it seems to me, of losing our nuclear deterrence in any way. But
I think that kind of hope comes out of moral commitment, to do some aggressive, in the sense of nonviolent, aggressive action to try to ameliorate the situation. But they're always going to be debatable. People will look back on that Kennedy initiative and say, as a result of that, we lost ground. That statement has been made, and the weighing of the results needs to go on. But to stop unilaterally trying to make initiatives, the bishops are saying we must go on with that.
I might point out what Michael Novak says in his very long article that appeared in the National Review entitled Moral Clarity in the Nuclear Age. That was in the April 1st, 1983 issue of the National Review, which is edited by William Buckley. And Novak, in that particular document, is suggesting that we really need to build up this whole idea of the nuclear weaponry. And he says that since 1968, that the United States really has been in what amounts to a free situation, that we really have not built any new weapons during all of that time. He thinks that under Secretary McNamara, we sort of went into that posture, and he gives us all of the various figures on that, and is suggesting that we just haven't expanded. We had something like 1,000 or so missiles back in '68, and we still have the same number. We had 31 submarines nuclear submarines, and we still have that. I guess it's 41 submarines. And that we had 300 and some bombers, and we still have that many, and they're getting gradually obsolete. Just to note the argument on the other side of that, his idea, he says, quote, virtually all arguments about the prevention of nuclear warfare hinge on judgments concerning the nature of the Soviet Union and its nuclear forces. And he goes on to say in '68 the U.S. had this big lead, but that Secretary of Defense McNamara froze the strategic bomber fleet at 600, land-based missiles at 1,054, maximum number of nuclear submarines at 41. And he says in 1982 we've got the same throw weight. We really haven't, increased this and put out any new systems. And so here we are with, his idea that we have been in a nuclear freeze. We haven't expanded, and the Russians have not responded positively. So I think we probably should get that out as what one might consider the other side of this whole argument of whether the independent initiatives really work or not.
expansion on the Russian side has tended to be in those intercontinental ballistic missiles, the great big land forces. And the interesting thing perhaps today is where our projection, the American projection of where arms is going to go in the last 3-4 years. That condition certainly has changed from what it was back in the late 60s.
Well, this relates closely to the whole battle over the B-1 bomber and the MX missile. I noticed in the latest draft the bishops dropped the phrase, the MX missile, and have referred, I suppose, to a broader kind of category of weaponry. They don't call it by name, but they talk about the weapons which are vulnerable to attack and yet able to give a prompt, hard target kill. And I think the way someone told me the other day that really is the MX, but they have simply broadened out their category. And they really are opposing that, the building of, I think what it effectively means is that they're opposed to the deployment now of the MX missile. You read it the same way, or?
Yes, I think that's the intention, the question of that amount of money for a weapon that is quite capable of being seen as an offensive weapon is the basic objection. The bishops are not...
They're totally opposed to the introduction of offensive nuclear weapons, that is for sure.
That's not the declared policy of America, but the capability is there with the MX.
Yeah. Now, Dan, you brought up before this whole idea of the conventional warfare, in which they have to try to address. I noticed that they are trying to minimize the risk of non-nuclear war as well. And in that regard, I think they're generally in favor of a reduction even of conventional forces and trying to control arms exports. They're trying to restrict the idea of the use of force to self-defense, really, or if other innocent people are under attack. Instead of thinking of conventional warfare as sort of just a general part of national policy in order to meet a lot of different kind of needs and so on, they're really trying to shrink that and say that the use of force only for self-defense or to defend others innocent who are under attack. And now there's an interesting thing that goes along with this, and that is the suggestion that if indeed we take away first strike or nuclear capability from NATO, if we say that's morally wrong, then do we have to be in favor of building up the conventional forces in Europe? And I think the bishops do make a nod to that and say, well, that could be possible. You know, it could be that on a short-term basis we would have to beef up the NATO conventional forces if indeed we would take as our policy no first strike of use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I think that's judging out of this proportionality kind of approach that says for the greater good in terms of trying to defend a nation, larger manpower and other than nuclear kinds of arms might be necessary.
Mm-hmm. And they take up in this section as well the idea of civil defense, and I think they're questioning that in there. What is the purpose of the civil defense? Is it protection, or is it to enhance our credibility and so on? That's, I think, maybe a volatile issue. Some countries have introduced strong civil defense measures, and I think that the Russians evidently have done a lot along this line. And, of course, we've had general resistance to it, I suppose, in this country.
And yet it's not a mandate against civil defense. You know, it's saying that means must be taken to try to ensure civilian population safety. But the kind of moves that create great skepticism and fear, more doubt of a national system, seem to be needed to be reanalyzed.
When they talk about this whole idea of being peacemakers, they're talking about this learning more about conflict resolution. I think they've suggested in other places that we stay in dialogue with our potential adversaries, that they like the context going on, that we find other ways of resolving conflicts other than violent ones. I suppose that's what's behind one of those suggestions to have a National Peace Academy, a place where we would study how to do this. I know some people in the secular world that who have made this suggestion that the pragmatic thing to do in the modern world is to figure out how to solve conflicts without the use of violence, and that violence simply doesn't work. It always escalates and produces new dictatorships, and so on. And so I really do think that perhaps their call here is something that needs to be followed out.
The temptation is always to use the masses of our resources on war. The suggestion of a peace academy has been around, they say, for 200 years when the other military academies were formed. It reminds me of the kind of thing where the National Arms Control Agency in the government is funded to the tune of about $30 million, the price of 2 F-16s, whereas the price of war making is funded to the tune of billions. We seem always to take the priority towards war making in terms of money and resources.
I was talking to a professor the other day about this idea of the pacifist position and how it appears as though one would just sort of sit back and let the adversary roll over one. And I was suggesting to her that it is very important to see the pacifist position as a positive one, that these people don't want to just sit back and be passive. Those two things are not equated. They're interested in finding positive ways of countering the evil in the world, of fighting against aggression. And so I think we have to give these people the benefit of seeing their courage and their activity and not reduce them to mere quietists or people who are totally passive.
In my conversations about this letter, I think it's become clear to me that the right of a nation to defend itself really is one that I believe in. I don't think we can live in the world the way it is without posing that right and acting for it. But I think there are other ways to act to defend one's nation than necessarily preparing for war. There are certainly, as we mentioned, the dialogue thing. There are trade relationships that I think ought to be promoted that are not yet a part of our style.
Cultural exchanges?
For sure. Even in our town of Toledo, people visiting Russia and Russians coming to visit us. That may seem like tourism, but I think it has something to do with peace.
Mm-hmm. And it could launch us into a large topic that we might at least begin to look at, and that is the second part of this whole third section of the bishop's document. It has to do with shaping a peaceful world, and it talks about the world order, and it points out that the Catholic Church has generally stressed the need for international organizations. The popes have supported the United Nations. Pope John the 23rd in 1963 in Pacem Terris called for sort of political and legal bonds among nations. In 1967, the Pope wrote the encyclical on the development of people and talked about the economic bonds that exist. And so we've had a real thrust in our Catholic Church towards this sense of international relationships. And I think what the document really calls to task both the Soviet Union and the United States for not doing more to support justice around the world, to creating a better economic order. They really are suggesting, I think, that there really isn't any answer to our problems in the long run with nuclear weapons other than an overarching political structure. If there's any one thing they've said in the document that's going to get people mad, I suppose it's that, because it's calling into question all of nationalism, of saying that nation-states aren't totally sovereign. What do they have that idea that nation-states have a relative moral value, but not an absolute one, so that we're part of an interdependent world?
They talk about the missing element being a properly constituted political authority with the capacity to relate to nations.
And you're quoting there,
yeah.
Yes.
It's there's no way that this over nation kind of let's call it government can exist without some delegation of political authority, and that's very scary. It is something that we've been thinking about in this century more than ever before, and seems to be an absolute necessity to think about and work for in the future.
I think they try to take a realistic approach to this international order when they think about the Soviet people. I think in this final draft they use the language something like this, that Soviet people or their leaders are human beings who are created in the image of God. They want to remind us of our fundamental dignity. And I think in the earlier drafts they said the Soviet leaders and the Soviet people are not monsters.
Yeah.
They put it now in more positive terms. But at the same time they say at times the Soviet behavior has been monstrous. And I think they're very aware of Eastern Europe, of what's going on in Poland, of the Afghanistan situation, the expansionism of the Soviet Union since the Second World War. I think they really want to be realistic about that, and I think that's proper. I think that the average American reading this document shouldn't think that our bishops have just gone totally soft on that whole idea. They want international cooperation. They realize we got to find ways to do it in which we have a common self-interest and not just expect them to act out of some sort of high moral standards.
Some of the bishops in their conversation talking about this document were really, we took insult with being accused of being pro-communist. I mean, our history, our ethnic background in America, our situation Catholic Church-wise in terms of freedom behind the Iron Curtain certainly gives us credentials to be realistic about Russian power and influence.
I think someone has suggested that the parameters of the moral debate have changed. They don't want to just see us good people in the United States against all those bad people in the Soviet Union. I think they want to see all of us as under the judgment of God, and that we all are morally responsible in order to try to make the world better. They want us to admit our faults as a nation as well. At the same time, I think they're keeping realistic about the Soviet expansionism and the dangers that brings to the world. But I think they want to believe and give us a hope that somehow détente is possible. So they offer, Dan, a lot of suggestions about how we can try to make this world a more peaceful place. I suppose the problem then becomes how we begin to implement those kinds of ideals and policies.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Father Dan Ray, the pastor of St. Ignatius Parish in Oregon. The topic of this week's reflections was the Bishop's Peace Pastoral, a promotion of peace. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio 43623.